Hey, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by Noah Bradon. Noah, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well, Dom. It's great to be able to have another conversation with you on your channel, and happy to be here.
No, it's great to have you. Thanks for coming on. Today, we're going to talk about your conversion story and what prompted you to basically decide to become Catholic. And I don't know anything about your background, so I'm actually very excited to learn about it. So, to kick things off, I guess I'll just start with did you grow up Christian? What was your background faith wise?
Yeah, no, I absolutely did grow up Christian. I was raised in a devout Protestant household. My grandfather was an RPC minister, Reformed Presbyterian, so one of the more
Okay.
conservative wings of Presbyterianism. And I was raised PCA, which is the larger of the conservative mainline Presbyterian denominations, at least in the U.S. And my father was an elder in the church, and my mom has always been a devout follower, a devout believer. So it was something that was not only taught to me, but something that was definitely sincerely held by many people around me, including my direct family members, as well as, family friends and other people like that. So I
Gotcha.
certainly, at least in my near family experience, had a very positive exposure to Protestant Christianity growing up.
That makes sense. So it's a Presbyterian church, huh? So what might be some of the core tenets that stick out that they're known for, the Presbyterians, like with baptism, holy orders, like what's their, faith alone? Could you tell us more about that?
Absolutely. So, as is often the case, it can be somewhat tricky talking about these things, right? Because I can say Presbyterian, and that can mean something different to many different people listening, especially with the denominations having undergone a couple internal splits over the years within the U.S.
Hmm.
The PCA and the PCUSA split, for example. But that's not directed to your question. So, I was raised as a 5-point Calvinist, so very
Okay.
much in line with traditional classical reformed theology as articulated by John Calvin, and then more specifically perhaps by John Knox, kind of in the Scotch Irish Protestant
Mm.
tradition. So my family was Scotch Irish kind of immigrants. I think it was something that was long held by them, in their family. So I wouldn't be surprised if I have an Irish Catholic great grandpa or grandmother praying for me at some point down the line, but certainly not to my knowledge, right? I was very much heavily steeped in Protestantism at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 5-point Calvinism. Um, so that would be total depravity. I'm not going to try to spout them all off, but I'll mess them up. I'll butcher. I always mix up a couple of the words, but it would have been the classical iteration of Reformed theology as articulated by John Calvin, namely. So he
Gotcha.
varied from, he sort of split off from Luther in a couple particular arenas. The emphasis on the Eucharist is certainly more of a symbolic focus within Calvinist traditions, although that's not always the case, right? There's always exceptions to these statements, which makes it tricky. So I'll just kind of perpetually be putting an asterisk by my statements about Protestants, because there's always gonna be like one commenter that's like, well, actually, there's this one, denomination of Protestantism where that's not true. And it's like, and you're wrong.
Yeah.
And you're right.
Hmm.
I will be. But these were infant Baptists, all Calvinists, really. Well, I shouldn't say all Calvinists are. I think Reformed Baptists will be Calvinists in most theologies. But
Hmm.
anyways, I'm kind of rambling now a little bit, but very much in the Presbyterian, but adjacent to Reformed Baptist. So a lot of my friends and family members were also in that Reformed Baptist camp, which would include the likes of John MacArthur and others. Although that wasn't directly what I was brought up on, a lot of my family members and close friends certainly were. And my wife's family was in that kind of MacArthur Reformed Baptist turned Presbyterian, kind of on the fence. There's a lot of kind of a loose alliance there that you see a lot in practice.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So basically, the tulip, 5-point Calvinism, faith alone, Bible alone, and but there is infant baptism, and so I'm guessing heavy focus on scripture, but the sacraments were symbolic, but were they efficacious?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there would be a vague sense, there would be a vaguely articulated idea that they were means, a sort of a visible means of an invisible grace. That language was not entirely
Okay.
foreign to me, even as a Presbyterian. but the
Mhm.
manner in which that was accomplished is often either left as a question mark or just kind of left in that more vague sense. And I find that's often the case. I think when you look to Calvin with respect to some of these things, he'll often take it much further than people might expect him to. Kind of modern day Protestants looking back, he might
Yeah.
take certain theological views further than they would expect as a Protestant, but he often would leave it slightly more in that mysterious level. And I think the same is true with Luther, with his articulation of the real presence versus the Catholic. The Catholic
Right.
much more precise and precisely defined the exact, you know, nature of kind of how the change happens, you know, especially in the West. Not so in the East as much, but yeah, a lot of those things were not entirely unfamiliar to me, but never really taken to their conclusion, if that makes any sense.
That does make sense. And so basically you were Presbyterian, you know, Reformed Calvinist theology most of your upbringing. Um,
Mm.
when did you start to look into this more? Did you have like a time period where you weren't sure if Christianity was true? Tell me more. How did things unfold?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So this was certainly I guess maybe as all conversions end up being in some senses, it's been a lifelong conversion story, right? And I've in many different ways tried to kind of condense it into only a few years, and inevitably I leave out things. So I'll try to kind of give you the big picture, and then we can zoom in, you know,
Okay,
as you will, or not. But so
excellent.
raised with that background, right? Raised in that Presbyterian, devout Presbyterian household. When I was young, my dad died, and then a couple years later, my grandpa died. So I mention this because I think it's
Mm,
actually relevant to the story because those were right the two theological figures, very much positive influences in terms of the representations of Protestant Christianity that they gave me, but also perhaps the most kind of direct influences I had in sort of a theological sense. So I certainly started to ask those internal philosophical questions, largely related to the problem of evil, right? Experiencing my own suffering, these types of things as I kind of got into my teenage years. Now, this was also around the time that I was exposed to high church Anglicanism. So
mm,
during high school, I was exposed to this, maybe kind of 15, 16, somewhere around that age. Which wasn't far off from the time that there was a school trip that I went over to Germany and we toured Catholic cathedrals, and I remember being in absolute awe of them. Excuse me. And I say this because I think these were some of the initial glimpses of Catholicism. So both with these beautiful representations of Catholic art in Europe that I started to experience somewhere midway through high school, I think sophomore, maybe between sophomore and junior year, this was,
mhm,
as well as being exposed to the high church Anglican liturgy. So this would be sort of the Anglo Catholic tradition, right? The Oxford movement
mhm,
over in England, very very high church. So liturgically speaking, incredibly familiar to a lot of Catholics, especially traditional Catholics, even the language used in it. Now, I didn't
yeah,
realize this at the time, right? This is me kind of assessing after the fact. I had no concept of this language, right? For me, it was entirely new. It was just high church liturgy. I didn't have quite the same categories in mind, but needless to say, I absolutely fell in love with the beauty of liturgy, with the beauty of liturgical
yeah.
Christianity. In addition to just being absolutely impressed by Catholic art. And I was raised. My mom was a fine artist, and she was raised with a great appreciation. She was a an art history major, so I grew up with a
Oh,
great appreciation for classical artists. I think this is a great asset to me, probably in my own conversion, right? So I definitely
yeah,
didn't grow up in this extremely austere representation of Protestant Christianity. It was a much more kind of beauty positive, more classically oriented, historically grounded expression. I'm really grateful for that because I think it had a lot of seeds planted that I think later sprouted into Catholicism in different ways, but I didn't realize it at the time, of course. So, um, and
no,
then
that's
yeah,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead. Well, I just wanted to interject because
Please, yeah.
that I find that really fascinating because and Hans Urs von Balthasar, the Catholic Swiss theologian who engaged a lot with Karl Barth and Protestant theology.
Mm,
He talks a lot about the kind of initial path of beauty and how that can lead you to the good and ultimately to the fullness of truth. I see that a lot now in conversions with
absolutely.
Protestants who become Catholic or even non Christians who get interested in Christianity and they're drawn towards Catholicism because of that history of beauty, art, architecture, music, all those incredible that patrimony, especially all in Europe over there. So I just find that really interesting that seems to be a common experience. And experience here is the right word, I think, because it's what begins to open the door, is that all that beauty. So I just noticed that.
No, I could not agree more, and I'm a huge fan of Balthazar, and I think Bishop Barron talks frequently. Like he's very much a fan of Balthazar himself, as I understand,
Yeah.
and he talks very much about the via pulchritudinus and the way of beauty. And it certainly was the case that for me, of the transcendentals, beauty was the most accessible. The one that first attracted me, piqued my curiosity. And then goodness, interestingly enough, when it comes to Catholicism, the fact that it produced so many saints was a little concerning to me, I suppose, or at least not concerning, but a kind of a yeah, I mean, incited more curiosity. If it's so bad,
Yeah.
why has it produced X, Y, and Z saints? I mean, Mother Teresa was particularly impactful on me, and it wasn't until after those first two things, those 2 points of attraction, if you will, those 2 experiences, encounters with the beautiful and the good, that I even cared enough to pursue a serious investigation of the truth claims of it. It took me many, many years before I did a rigorous investigation of the truth claims. So in some sense, my conversion was quick, but only because it took me so long to get to the point where I actually started to give a real serious consideration of those truth claims. And it was absolutely as a result of beauty and then later goodness. So I don't think it can
Yeah.
be overstated, really. And I think that we should all remember that in many respects. I don't know how exactly it always will play out in our lives, but just to remember that in some sense, you have to be attracted before you can be convinced.
Mhm.
And of course, there's the Holy Spirit's working that cannot be neglected either. But I'm speaking, from our perspective as the people trying to participate in it. So, but yeah, man,
No,
goodness then truth, absolutely.
yeah. No, I just love the way you describe that. I mean, again, sorry to interject, but
Oh,
this is
please,
just
let's just keep talking. Don't worry, it doesn't have to be formal. I love it either way. You run the show.
no, this is great because it's funny because Joseph Ratzinger, who was a good friend of Hans Urs von Balthasar,
Mm.
also said that the most powerful evangelistic witness is precisely the heritage of beauty of Christianity, but also the saints. Arguments, philosophical cases, even theology, and at the end of the day, what really is the most effective tool in evangelization is the lives of the saints. How you have this track record, these like constellations on the path of the church of these incredible human beings. And what other kind of cultural movement has produced that? And so I like when you say it got concerning. I think what you mean is like, this is concerning. Maybe it's true because you thought Catholicism couldn't be
Yeah.
compatible with what you were taught. So you're like, uh-oh. So
Well,
that's
it makes
great. I
you
love that.
pause, right? When you have this idea, when you grew up with misconceptions about Catholicism. So I think it's probably important to jump back and just mention that I grew up believing that Catholics could be saved, but that it was unlikely. So that was very
Mm,
much the language that I had in mind for Catholics. I was not entirely anti-Catholic, but right, we were raised on the Westminster Confession. So if anyone's kind of particularly interested in these types of things, that was the particular confession that we adhered to. And although the version that we subscribed to at the time of my upbringing did not include this line, the original version included an explicit denunciation of the Pope as the Antichrist or as an Antichrist. Don't quote me on whether it was a the or an. I don't remember. But that's kind of a little bit of a trivial point. And that was later removed, but it wasn't until relative recent history that even that line was removed. So I was raised in a very anti-Catholic, in an intellectual sense. I was raised very anti-Catholic. In a
mhm.
practical sense, that was not the case, right? Like we knew Catholics, not many, but we had kind of Catholic acquaintances, and there was never tension or animosity or anything like that. But
Yeah,
intellectually speaking, there was a strong aversion to Catholicism that was deep seated in me. So I
that
wanted
makes
to kind
sense.
of mention that because I think it is important at the
Yeah.
time of my exposure to these examples of beauty, both through the churches themselves, the architecture, the works of art, the liturgy, the lives of the saints. Right, in some sense, it's all beauty, kind
Mhm,
of attracting us even through the lives of the saints. The goodness, it was these beautiful stories of the saints that attracted to me. So I could maybe argue that it was always art forward in
mhm.
terms of my own conversion. But
Awesome. Well, I mean, so this is I think a great we talked about beauty, we talked about the saints and how that concerned you, and now maybe okay, what about the claims of the Catholic Church, these truth claims, yeah, how did things unfold for you from here?
So it's really interesting. So at the point when I was looking into undergrad, for whatever reason, probably because the Blessed Mother was pointing me to her church, and I say that sort of half tongue in cheek, but also I'm kind of growing increasingly convinced that that was indeed the case. I became increasingly attracted to Notre Dame as a university. I
Yeah.
don't exactly know why. I honestly did not know a single person who had ever attended. I had no one in my life who had been. Like there was zero personal connection to the university, but for whatever
Mhm.
reason, it rose as my top school. And when I got in, um, I had the good fortune of having a couple friends who were seminarians there, who were actually devout Catholics, and certainly I was also around many people who were nominal Catholics as well. Right, it was freshman
Yeah.
year undergrad. It's definitely a melting pot of the Catholic world at Notre Dame, but the good and the bad, all of it is there for sure. Um,
Mhm.
but I was fortunate to be exposed to some people who took the time to walk through some of my misconceptions. And I remember the one distinctly that was corrected at Notre Dame my freshman year was related to, or maybe it was my sophomore year, but regardless, related to intercession of saints and my
Mm.
misunderstanding of how the Catholic teaching on the intercession of saints, I incorrectly viewed that as an elevation of saints into this realm of deity, right? It's an elevation of the saints to deities, and therefore it's false worship. I had this misconception, and I was an
Mhm.
easy sell on that one, I will say, admittedly, because it took just like a very clear and logical progression of how Catholics kind of came to this understanding. And I
Mhm.
still wasn't necessarily convinced that saints were actively interceding on our behalf, right? That's something I think that came much later. But I was very quickly convinced that I had been not only wrong in my understanding about what the teaching actually said, but then
Mhm.
also that it actually was a logically consistent teaching. I wasn't quite convinced that it was true, right? But I was convinced that it was logically consistent, and that was something that had a profound impact on me. And this was coupled with another very, very impactful experience I had actually in my freshman year cosmology class at Notre Dame, because that was the first time I was ever exposed to the idea that there were Christians, and this is wild, right? If you're a Catholic and have been a Catholic for a long time, this is going to sound outlandish, but coming from my very
Mhm.
conservative Protestant upbringing, I didn't even know that there were Catholics who believed in evolution in any larger macro sense of the word, right?
Mm.
There was, well, sorry, micro, macro, yeah, larger kind of macro
Yeah.
sense of the word. And this was something that had been long kind of eating at me, the lack of reconciliation between certain religious and scientific ideologies, and how religion often seemed to butt heads with reason. And
Yeah.
that was something that bothered me because I implicitly knew, I think, just as someone who cared about truth and cared about truth claims, that
Mhm.
something couldn't be both true and not true in the same sense, right? You know, that classical concept of truth. So if science is teaching something that's true, and then that's in direct contradiction to something that religion is teaching us is true, they can't both be true at the same time. Like this was something that like was just so obviously true for me, right? Just based on classical reasoning.
Mhm.
I wasn't content to just be like, well, my religion taught it to me, so it must be true. I was actually more kind of on the side of reason being the more self-evident kind of reliable foundation for truth claims at that time.
Yeah.
And so it was really impactful on me. And I know that there's multiple interpretations that are permitted within Catholicism, but it was really impactful for me because I was coming from more of a secular mindset, someone who was very science positive, like very science focused in terms of how to come to know about the world around us. And to come to find out that not only was it permitted within Catholicism, but it was actually a Catholic priest who was at the start of some of the Big Bang Theory and talking about that blew my mind. It absolutely blew my
Yeah.
mind. And I know that some people can push back on that, and that's fine. But the point was almost more of an underlying worldview shock, in the best possible sense of the word shock, because it again pointed to this compatibility of faith and reason that I'd been yearning for but not seeing within some of my Protestant communities. And so it started to again make me just kind of wonder about Catholicism. I started to take it more seriously at that
Yeah.
point. Again, I wasn't convinced that it was true, but I did start to really not only be attracted to it, but really respect it. And I think that's a really important stage because I think it was right around that early undergrad period that happened. Because I think that laid the groundwork for those later years.
No, that's great. I mean, actually, I think it's Stephen Bullivant. He did some sociological work on this, and that Catholicism is perceived to be much more compatible with science and reason
Mm,
than other forms of Christianity in the popular kind of sociological landscape. So that makes sense, that exposure to the fact that Catholicism is a form of Christianity that is much more a champion of reason and science than other forms can be sociologically. And I think there's some good studies on that. But what I find interesting is again, you start with beauty, the lives of the saints, goodness. And now, the kind of debunking of these false narratives, this is usually the next step in people's kind of discovering of Catholicism. And then the fact that you have faith and reason together, a lot of this is why I think Bishop Barron's work is so fruitful, because it takes precisely the path that you have trodden, basically, right? Which is, we start with beauty. We overwhelm you with the heritage of Christianity, all its art and architecture. And then we start, kind of showing you that, freedom is liberating when you align yourself with the kind of laws of nature. And
mm,
then you discover the fact that Catholicism is smart, and it's compatible with scientific, investigation. And it kind of leads you right up to the door of the church, the sacramental initiation. And I just find it really awesome. Your story is just like, the work of Bishop Barron in evangelization, which, by the way, I wonder how exposed did you discover Word on Fire and stuff like that?
he was hugely impactful on my conversion. So this was this framework was something that I largely dropped for the next 10 years, kind of after about my sophomore year, for about 10 years. But I say all this
Yeah.
because I think it was an essential foundation that was later picked up by the likes of Bishop Barron in particular, as well as a handful of the Ascension content was definitely integral,
Mhm.
as well as a handful of books that I've read. Marcellino D'Ambrosio's When the Church Was Young. There's a
Mhm.
handful of like some of the Scott Hahn works. Then Trent Horn, discovering him was kind of big. So there was all these people that very much picked up on these sort of strings, right? That we've been talking about, that you just described so well with respect to the sort of the reasonability of it, as well as I think the way that it is taken seriously in the secular world in a different way. Now, I can understand the counter argument that like maybe Christians shouldn't care about that. Like I can kind of hear that, but you have to understand that I was coming at it from the secular academic mindset. I
Yeah.
wasn't at that point coming from the let's figure out what's the most devout religious option. I was trying to figure out what was the most reasonable option, and
Yeah.
that's what drew me in. Was not the religious component, but the reasonability of it. The kind of the fact that it could be rationally explained, and the fact
Mhm.
that it took seriously those other subjects outside of theology. Notre
Mhm.
Dame requires, and I think it's still true, requires freshmen to take both philosophy and theology as a requirement. Like that's a part of like undergraduate curriculum, and it's a very much an introductory level, right? It doesn't go heavy hitting into it, but it equally treats all of these liberal arts subjects as this equally respected foundation. And at the time, I respected it because I felt like it was a true liberal arts education, right? In that sort of classical sense of the word, because it actually exposed me to all of these ideas. Like it was one of the few places that you could actually hear people debate ideas and have like polar opposite ideas and actually be conversing at and respecting each other. And that's rare in the classroom, right? Because often is the case, if you have a school that encourages that type of conversation, it tends to be an echo chamber. So it's a
Mhm.
rare thing indeed when you have a school that both isn't an echo chamber and then also encourages that. Now, granted, some of my experience is limited, right? So I was a freshman, that was 07, 08. And then now I'm back at grad school, but it's in the theology department, which is definitely an
Mm.
oasis away from the rest of the school. But I think it still largely stands true. And I think that cannot be, I don't know, I think we should all maybe remember that kind of in our own lives. And maybe it's why I care so much about Catholics seeming reasonable when they talk about other subjects. I think it's why these types of things matter, the optics of engaging in political and social discussions. I'm not saying Catholics shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that they should be mindful of the impact, for good or for ill, of those types of engagements, right? Because if you make Catholics seem ridiculous, people are less likely to actually believe the other truth claims that we make, even if they're not related, right? Even if it's a fallacy built in there. It's just how the human mind works.
I completely agree. I deal with this a little bit sometimes online and even in person,
Mm,
things that are not related to, for example, the Catholic view of justification versus the Lutheran view, for example, right?
Sure.
But other things like scientific questions or questions of literature and the way you interpret scripture, fundamentalist ways of doing things. These do in fact inform the perception of Christianity that people have, and they do end up landing on the scale of for or against, even though they may not be related to certain
Absolutely.
certain other questions. So I completely agree with you, and I see this, and that's why people kind of get annoyed at me sometimes, because I push back against some of those things, and people tell me, Dom, that's not related to what you're talking about, and I'm like, it actually is, you know. So that's excellent. um and what you're saying, and this conversation is great because it has ramifications, larger ramifications, and I think what really excites me about the future of Christianity in the Western world, or just in the world in general, is that we live in a kind of post Enlightenment era where reason is kind of divorced from faith, has kind of gone wild, and it's losing its ground, it's losing its values, and then faith is kind of, because it's been separated from reason sociologically, historically, is kind of becoming a little fanatical, a little I don't know how to put this, fundamentalist, kind of sectarian.
Sure.
And Joseph Ratzinger is the one that really argues for faith and needs reason, and reason needs faith. They keep themselves in check, right? And I
Absolutely.
think the Catholic Church is the place where we have an opportunity to defend that vision. And works, and I keep bringing this up because I think they do a great job, but works like Word on Fire, I think, is the future, if we really want to get serious about this, is the future of Christianity in the Western world, and and its expansion. So your story, I think, is a good kind of microcosm example of what we have looking forward. And people like you and Drew on Drew the Catholic channel, and,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
other people like that, you guys motivate me. You really do, because there's a
Oh,
lot of
thanks.
people, complaining, upset, and we are in a cultural crisis. There's no denying. But it's these new converts, man, who are moved by beauty and the heritage of the church, that really motivates me.
Mm.
And I think that's the future. It's that kind of work, that marriage of reason and faith, where they can criticize each other and help each other that way.
Absolutely.
Um,
Oh, that's
Drew's
great. Thank you
Drew's in
for
the
saying
chat.
that. I
Yeah, go
feel
ahead.
I feel similarly about that, about Drew and you and all the other people, right? It's definitely, like, I think a communal effort, right? There's an inspiration. Oh, I can see
Mhm.
this. Hey, Drew. Um, and it's wonderful. I think, 'cause I think there's a lot of I don't know, mutual. I don't know what the word is. Mutual inspiration, I think, in these
Yeah.
groups, and
No,
that's
absolutely.
wonderful. I think the only people that I get upset with, the people that are always upset and complaining all the time, right?
Right, yeah. Well, let's maybe dive into particulars, right? So you started to realize that a lot of the things you believed weren't accurate, and so tell us maybe how, things started to peel back, like the Mary question, the Pope question, justification. Take it away.
Sure, absolutely. So, um, at the same time of my being exposed to these beautiful aspects of Catholicism and my having this kind of newfound respect and at least curiosity being kindled, right? We've been talking about that. This was also the time that I was largely deconstructing my own personal faith. I think my own, at least in a religious expression. I never went the atheist route, but I kind of was in that moral theism or what do they call it, kind of like the moral therapeutic. I forget what
Yeah.
that word is. I didn't even have that type of language back then, but I basically deconstructed Christianity into something that loosely resembled Christian moralism, that is naturally, as is always the case, was crafted into my own image, right? Because I mean, sort of by necessity, if I'm the one crafting it, I'm sort of the one deciding, kind of picking and choosing, deconstructing, but at the same time, not rejecting all that I was brought up in. So I think that was very much kind of the name of this phase. Like, I
Mm.
recognized that there was some good things about my upbringing. I hadn't rejected all of it. And yet there had been too many times where faith had seemed to butt up against reason. And the community that I was part of had just sort of given up, kind of mocked the reason side, and that was something that I very much resented, I think, or wanted no part of, right? So I was resisting
Mm.
that. And so I went through a tailspin, I think, for many years, right? I mean, I think the Christian moralism is a sort of the polite, anachronistic look at what I was doing, but I think effectively I'd given into hedonism, right? I would sort of was seeking truth, but it was more kind of this experiential existentialism, that kind of was emerging, kind of a loosely Christian inspired existentialism. I don't know if it's helpful to describe it in all of those with all those wacky words, but
No, that's helpful.
maybe there's something there, because I was thinking about these things at the time. So this is not all just my analysis after the fact. Like, I was very much cognizant of this, and I think I was even. I mean, with people that I was close with, I would have been a self-avowed existentialist, right? So I very much embraced Oscar Wilde's preface of the Dorian Gray, preface of Dorian Gray, right? His like aesthetic manifesto, which is basically like aestheticism, beauty for beauty's sake. That was very much what I was. I loved beauty in every sense of the word, and I believed that it was valuable in and of itself. So I believed in the transcendental, at least that one. I wasn't quite so sure about the other two, I think, at that point in my life.
Yeah.
But I at least clung to that. I think it's important to say that because in some sense, perhaps it was one of those things that kept me grounded, sort of, at least in sort of that intellectual sense, because I never I was always reluctant to completely give up that foundation that some things have objective value in and of themselves, this sort of intrinsic transcendental value. Anyways, so sort of over years of kind of trying different things, not going to church, going back to church that I grew up in, going to non-denominational churches. I kind of explored. I was sort of non-committal for a while, then went back and started exploring as a conscientious dissenter within Protestantism, where I was like not really sure what I believe, but I was kind of like exploring around, trying to figure out something, almost more value for the community side of it. It was actually at the church that I grew up in when I was reattending it in sort of my mid-20s that I met my now wife. And I was at that point attending the Presbyterian church. The pastor knew that I didn't really agree with the Reformation. At that point, I was struggling a lot with this concept of unity. And I think that was a deep-seated motivation that sparked this truth search at the end of my conversion, which I think is sort of the meat of it, I think, that we're probably getting into now. Is why was I convinced? How was I convinced? And I think happened a lot when I was at this Protestant church, being continually reminded of how not reformed I was, because I had started to encounter these various forms of Catholicism, sometimes not knowing it was these were versions of Catholicism, right? I think that's often the case when you're stumbling upon Christian ideas and you're reading thinkers. I was reading C.S. Lewis, I was reading G.K. Chesterton, I was getting exposed to these thinkers. So I had a lot of this Catholic worldview, I think, that had really seeped in at that point. Quite frankly, much more so than I probably realized at the time, right? And that's often, I think, what has to happen first. That sort of that worldview has to start shifting a little bit, and so that you can kind of be open to the arguments. And and so it was something that I didn't really care. How am I trying to say this? I had many questions, and there were many things that I knew that I didn't agree with within the Protestant tradition that I was attending. But I didn't really care that there were questions, right? It was just sort of an amicable disagreement. I had a very much broad concept of ecumenical Christianity, where we're all Christians, no one knows, high degree of skepticism at this point. So I had a high emphasis on unity, and then a high emphasis, sort of a high degree of skepticism at the same point. So that reduced this sort of, so we're all Christians in a sense. There is a theological bullseye perhaps somewhere, but I don't really know exactly where it is. That was the church's general concept framework for talking about these things that I was attending. The Presbyterian church was talking about bullseye theology, right? We're all Christians. There's some things that are at the center, and then there's kind of less important things that we just don't really need to worry about. Like, maybe they matter, but let's not like get too upset about it. That was sort of the general defense of the myriad denominations and the splitting and the kind of the way of reconciling all of it as Protestant Christianity was largely that bullseye concept. So I didn't reject that. I guess I came to see that as something that was clearly misaligned with the biblical concept of unity, and especially with Christ's command to remain one as he and the Father are one, this sort of inseparable, intimate union that I just quite frankly couldn't see there. And this was prompted, I think, even maybe immediately before going back to the Presbyterian church, I was at a multi-denominational church, and I'd been attending there for many years. And then they asked me if I wanted to get baptized again.
Mm,
Again, because I was baptized as an infant, right? Had a Trinitarian valid baptism as an infant.
yeah.
I remember even in that time of not caring, so to speak, of having all these question marks and not caring, I remember that bothered me, because I guess at that point I was still too Orthodox / Catholic, because I knew that was a problem. I knew that another baptism, I'm like, no, this is just like wrong. And it was like, why are you asking me to do this? And the pastor was asking me to be rebaptized. And I was like, well, I
Yeah.
certainly can't stay here. And that's what led me back to the Presbyterian church, right? And then
Ah,
that was where the kind of the rejection of this bullseye ecumenical concept of kind of reconciling the lack of unity within the perceived lack of unity, at least from my now perspective,
mhm.
within Protestantism. And I just felt that the bullseye theology was ultimately, if true, too flimsy to really do anything with, because it was effectively reducing the essentials to something either so tiny that everyone is included in it, and effectively nothing can be determined as essential. And I'm saying that somewhat tongue in cheek, but not really. It was like, Jesus is God and he came to save us for our sins. And it's like, oh man, like what else? And
Yeah.
it's like, and I don't want to straw man them, right? Like I am, for sake of time, I think, skirting over it, and I'm not doing a great job
No,
of it, but
no,
it felt
yeah.
that way to me.
No, that makes sense. It's almost like, because of all these divisions, you kind of adopted a largely relativistic view where as long as we believe that Jesus is God, he existed and he saved us, then we're good. And that's like the essential, and everything else we can kind of disagree on. But
Exactly.
how unified does that really, make us? And how faithful to Jesus's wish really is that? And how biblical is it really? And so what does unity mean? And as Catholics, we believe, unity, first and foremost is in the sacraments, that we can commune at each other's altars, right? We can commune it as one body. But that
Exactly.
also means, that we believe in what the sacraments are, and that the fact that we can commune at each other's altars implies a common faith and a common governance, which isn't, the case in Christianity today. We don't have that kind of communion. So it seems to me that you're moving closer and closer towards this kind of sacramental understanding of communion, and further away from this relativistic understanding of Christianity as a kind of private belief system. You know what I mean? So it's
You're absolutely
becoming
right.
more concrete in your search. And I kind of see, I kind of see, that's kind of God drawing you closer and closer to the unity of his body, and away from the kind of, you might say, the confusion of one's own theology. To me, that's kind of the difference here between scattered Christianity, is where, we kind of rely on our own lights, but unified Christianity is the drawing, a move of Christ in his body. He kind of draws us up into himself sacramentally. And really, I think that's what does it for a lot of Protestants when they discover the Catholic understanding of this corporate unity. And it sounds like that's what was going on in your life, and you can't but see God's grace in that, and that move towards fullness, right? So
Mm.
anyway, I'm ranting, but
No,
I
it's great.
see the providence in your path. That's really beautiful to see that. So
No, I love that. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think you're absolutely right in your framing of that. And I was absolutely, a sort of almost was backing myself into this sacramental worldview in some sense without realizing it, almost by realizing the things that I was rejecting. So it almost started out by first being like, oh no, I certainly don't believe that. Then I'm like, oh no, like that can't be the case. And then I'm like, started to like back myself into realizing that I did
yeah.
have some of these, I think, concepts of what Orthodox Christianity had to look like. And I think
Mhm.
perhaps that was largely because of the foundation, partly because of the good theology that was given to me by my parents, because certainly some of it was good. I mean, some of the core foundation
Mhm.
was very helpful, and then I think by the exposure to the sort of Catholic adjacent sacramental life with the Anglo Catholicism
Anglican.
that I
Yeah. Mhm.
encountered, and then as well as attending mass, various points at Notre Dame, and then encountering good Catholics who helped me, reconsider my thinking. It was kind of, I was slowly, I think I had that framework, and I don't know, I realized how
Yeah.
firmly it had taken hold, perhaps, until I started encountering these things that were so clearly not the case, so clearly
Yeah.
not the way to proceed. And I will admit that it really came to a head when my wife and I started to seriously talk about having children, and when that like when we started to prepare for having children, that started to change, I think, very radically in my mind. That shifted
Mhm.
because I knew that those questions that I had been content leaving as question marks were not sufficient for raising my kids on. I mean, that was something that it felt flimsy at that point to me when I started to think about how am I going to raise my kids in this if I don't even know what Christianity should look like. I don't even know what denomination best describes what I believe. I'm
Yeah.
only sort of slowly figuring out what I don't believe in a sense. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you noticed that sacramental draw, because I think one of the great and one of the great specifics that pushed me away from at least low church Protestantism was the removal of the emphasis on the Eucharist as the center of the service and the
Mm.
replacement of it with the sermon. This
Mm.
was something that bothered me a long time before I had any inkling that I'd become Catholic. It was something that started to kind of eat at me. And I think largely probably because of my exposure to the traditional Anglicanism and seeing that there was an alternative, but then also starting to just realize how much of a disparity of views there is, even within Protestantism, with respect to the focus of the service. So the
Mhm.
entire it's like, so in a sense, there's not agreement on what the worship should be centered on within
Mhm.
Protestantism. Some Protestants will say it's the Eucharist, and some Protestants will say it's the preaching and teaching of the word. And then this started to really kind of eat at me. I'm like, there's not even a central shared concept of like what this service is for. Like, what is the inherent purpose of why we are here on Sunday morning?
Yeah.
And I was at a church that was using, grape juice and bread. And I remember that bothered me long before I became Catholic. Why not
Yeah.
wine? It says wine. Like, I mean, I wasn't
Yeah.
even like believing in the real presence. I was just like, it says wine. Like, why not use wine? Just
Mhm.
kind of like, so I remember there was just all these little things over the years. So I kind of have somewhat spelled this out chronologically, but also inevitably it's picking back all these little threads that, all these little seeds that the Holy Spirit had planted, over the
Yeah.
years. Um, and I still didn't realize that Catholicism was the solution, right? But I think at that point I had firmly realized that I was not Presbyterian, I was not Reformed, and I couldn't raise my kids in that way. So we started to
Mhm.
actively seek answers, and I think that's when the focus of my search, the focus of my journey, I think shifted. I think at that point when I realized that I wasn't content not to know anymore. So I was at least
Yeah.
determined to figure out something better than what I had, right? Like some
Yeah.
clearer vision.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so we've basically kind of arrived, right? You're like, okay, I'm taking this seriously now.
Mm.
Catholicism. What were the things you needed to make sure you worked through before you could continue and actually, fully enter? Like, what were some stumbling blocks that you had to work through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned the early stumbling block of the intercession of saints that was cleared up fairly easily.
Yeah.
I think at this point I was fairly cognizant of the basically, I was already very aware that it all was going to come down to the matter of authority. It didn't take me very long to see that
Yeah.
ultimately the claims are essential authority claims and essential claims about ecclesial visibility. I mean, there are many ways to break down the Protestant Catholic divide and discussion and approach this, but to me, ultimately, it's like, God, did Jesus establish a visible church, and does that visible church continue to exist with a visible authority structure? And I know that Protestants would say, well, we all agree with that, and it's like, okay, but then you have to kind of go back historically and look at the how and the
Yeah.
which and the all those types of things. And I
Mhm.
think I had become a firm believer in this concept of, well, I had become a firm believer in the concept of ecclesial unity, and I knew that
Mhm.
that unity had to have some visible component. And I was
Mhm.
dissatisfied with what I was currently seeing within Protestantism, what they were pointing to as this visible component, the kind of the bullseye theology that didn't feel substantive enough to kind of cling to. And then there
Yeah.
was others that kind of had loose kind of alliances where they would allow you to preach at different congregations, different denominations. I was like, okay, that's something closer to communion, right? Like, I mean, that's
Mhm.
something closer to a full communion, intercommunion. Um, but it was something that was really eating at me was, that a Lutheran couldn't talk to couldn't preach at a Presbyterian service if they were talking about the sacraments or something, right? You know, there's
Mhm.
such incompatibility of viewpoints. So there might be sort of this loose allegiance. So I think it was sort of leaning closer and closer to this recognition that it was going to come down to the sacraments. There was something about a shared belief in the sacraments that was required for this union, right? So naturally,
Mhm.
the Eucharist is the particular, I think, example, or the most, the sort of most prominent example of what that means. So I
Mhm.
started studying the early church fathers and their beliefs in the real presence, and kind of how this played out, and just kind of the role of sacraments within the church. I think that was something
Mhm.
that kind of very much early on caught my eye. When I say early on, I mean like in this period of time that we're talking in, right? This was about a year and a half, 2 years before I ended up converting. So we're getting pretty close to the actual conversion. Like I said, the end was pretty sped up. It was kind of a condensed ending
That's
on
okay.
truth
Yeah.
claim bit. So I may have lost the thought there, but hopefully there was something cogent.
Yeah, no, yeah. So the especially the Eucharist, but the sacraments. How can we be united around our understanding of the sacraments? And I think you really did perceive that the sacraments and communion are themselves intertwined. And
Mm,
so, if there is a solution about all this division, it has something to do with the sacraments. And I mean, that reminds me of something that I read recently, where faith is, because Paul and in the New Testament, you hear these different passages, a whole slew of passages about how, have faith in Christ and you will be saved, through God's grace and through faith you're saved. But then there's these passages about baptism in order to be saved, like in Peter's, I think it's his second letter. So you have these passages about faith and these passages about baptism, and sometimes they overlap. And so which one is it? Is it faith or is it baptism? And the thing being is that faith is what is needed on the individual side, but also the sacrament is basically the ecclesial form of faith. It's the faith of the church. It's what makes us one body. You kind of need that sign of unity, which is the kind of concrete expression. Think like the way I like to think about it, and I'm ranting here, but the way I like to think about it is you can intend to make a promise to someone, but at the end of the day, if you want that communion to be established, you need to shake on it and verbalize your promise. So you need a visible sign that communicates invisible communion. And so to me, it's like, is it faith or is it baptism? The answer is yes. It's just that baptism is the ecclesial dimension of the faith that saves you. And so again, you have this disparity of what Christians believe. Well, the way that you can have a unity in that faith is precisely through the sacrament. And
mm.
so communion and sacraments is a way to have communion in creed. And anyway, that's kind of a rant, but the point being is
Oh,
I
it's
think
great.
you're perceiving the fact that there needs to be communion here. That's what Jesus wanted. He established a church. He established a communion, and it revolves around the sacraments. And then you discover the church fathers, and like, oh, wait a minute here, and so I love that. But what about the things like, because authority you said was like really important, and it is. It's one of those linchpins. But what about things like Mary and purgatory? How did you deal with those things?
Yeah, no, so it's interesting. So I think I realized that it was going to be about authority. So I had this concept of visibility, and I had this concept of the Eucharist needing to be at the center of the service. And I think that was the holdover from the Anglicanism and the exposure to that,
Ah,
and just
yeah.
that did feel like it. I know that I'm using kind of feel language, but it felt like that was the more accurate representation of like what the service should be centered around. So I think I had this loose concept, right? And then I had this strong desire for ecclesial unity. And then I started to just look back at the fathers and kind of got a little bit of a sense, I think, for their emphasis. But I don't think at this point I was strongly considering. I want to make sure I don't kind of butcher the timeline too badly. So I had all of these desires. We're getting ready to have a family. Like I knew that I had to have something more solid to lean on, and I was doing research, but I will admit that I didn't have a lot of direction to this research. And around
Mm,
this time that we're talking about in this time period, I met a friend who was an integral part of my conversion,
mhm,
and someone that a chance encounter, right? Clearly, like a God thing, putting him in my life at the right time. We met at a a fundraiser banquet. We were sat next to each other by a mutual friend. I legitimately thought he was a business lead. I was running my own company at the time, and
Yeah.
I was trying to sell him on, like on my services, right? So I mean, I was like, so we hit it off though really well. And I asked him if he wanted to grab lunch, and again, I'm thinking business lunch. And we sit down at lunch, and he very, he asked if he could pray for lunch before he did. He's like, hey, do you mind if I pray for the meal? And he didn't know much at all about my background, and he, to my knowledge, he had no clue, and he did. And then he did the very clear, Catholic crossing of himself. And honestly, man, that shifted the entire conversation. We spent the entire conversation talking about Catholicism, religion. He was a convert, had a lot of a similar path to me now, but at the time, he very much was the right person to meet me in that kind of general period of searching without having the direction, right? So I had all of these early seeds of Catholicism sown. I was definitely attracted to Catholicism. I saw it as a reasonable option at this point, right? I was very much I was very Catholic friendly. I wouldn't have called myself that from end of high school all the way on. I would have called myself I would have been very openly Catholic friendly. So for a long time now at this point. But I hadn't given it serious consideration, I don't think, until I started to have these long conversations with him. And when I say long conversations, I think he and I spent 5 to 10 hours a week for months talking, like insane, just on the phone, in person. And he just hashed out my concerns, my misconceptions. We talked. He gave me reading recommendations. About 6 months into this, 4 to 6 months into this, he asked if he could introduce me to a priest friend of his. And this is a Thomist priest who basically at that point met me where I was at then, kind of multiple months forward in that point, and took it the rest of the way. So I know I just sort of summed up a lot of discussions in one, so I can kind of go back and
that makes sense.
Go back the layers, but I think it's helpful to just kind of give that overview of the timeline. And at that point, I think I was all but done. I think about a month in with the conversation, because I was convinced, and it was only a matter of being convicted. How I got to that point, how I got from the Eucharist is probably, needs to be more valued than it was, in the church I grew up in, to wanting visibility to their goodness. I think there were a couple key tenets. I had to see that the Catholic Church was, this is my very biased opinion, but the Catholic Church was the only church that I saw visibly and actively seeking the reunification of all of Christendom. And I saw this happen in so many different ways. I mean, the joint declaration on justification that the Catholic Church issued with the various Lutheran communities was incredibly impactful for me when I was looking into this. I loved the kind of the humility and the intentionality of going back and saying, look, maybe there's more agreement here than we actually thought if we properly understand each other. And I just kept seeing that effort, that kind of that reaching out, the reaching across of John Paul II to the Eastern Orthodox, the active attempts to reunite the church, and the profound way that the Catholic Church does that on an institutional level, and certainly imperfectly, right? But from my perspective on the outside, it was like something I had never seen, because most of the people that I encountered when I was on fire about this concept of unity, they either had this flimsy idea of unity where it's like, we're united in our disagreements. And there were major disagreements, right? Not like minor petty things, but like really big, like life-altering decision type stuff. And then there was the Catholic Church, and the way, I guess, that was the profound goodness of it. And
Can I interject?
Please. I don't even know if I had any clarity beyond that.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to capitalize on this point right here, because again, talking with Drew was the same thing. For I'm talking to someone was on the outside, who came in, right? So your perspective, your experience comes from someone on the outside, and I think that is important for us on the inside to hear. Because oftentimes, we get that kind of what's that expression on the internet when you're locked into a bubble? Echo chamber. Sorry, echo chamber. I lost the expression. Yeah. So we have this kind of limited field of vision where we can become very critical of the way things are managed in our own tradition, our own chamber, what have you. But it really does help to listen to people on the outside coming in, or on the outside looking in, maybe not even coming in, right? And a lot of this for me as well, because I kind of had a transition where I started to expand my horizons, and I started to read atheists, Anglicans, Orthodox, Buddhists, and just to kind of like, you need to be able to stretch yourself a little bit to be able to look at where you're at in a way that's more informed. And I feel like oftentimes, this is a huge reason behind the division in Christendom, is
Mm,
there's all of this navel gazing going on in different traditions. And obviously, I believe the Catholic Church is the fullness of truth, and that its tradition is a divine apostolic tradition. And but there's wiggle room for self criticism and for improvement, right? And the what you described is basically, you look at this kind of field, this playing field of divided Christendom, and the Catholic Church is the one trying to, keep people on the boat and bring them back in, and kind of, let's make this work. We got to move forward. We got a mission. Christ gave us something to do. He left something behind. But people that are navel gazing are kind of like, well, you're compromising too much over here. And sometimes they're right, like you said. Sometimes it's
yeah,
imperfect.
yeah.
Sometimes that was handled poorly. But we need this kind of input from people on the outside to kind of, put the brakes on. Look, dude, chillax. I'm you can probably tell I'm speaking from experience, because I
Yeah,
deal with
oh,
kind of in-house fighting, and I'm trying to tell people, how about you get off the internet and you read, some more Catholic theology, get a good foundation, and then read some Anglicans, read some atheists, see how you can, learn from them. People are like, because I grew up thinking you can't read anyone who's like a heretic. Like, you can't read Martin Luther or you're going to go to hell or something. It's like, you have to know what the complaints are in order to address them with the truth of your tradition.
mm.
And I'm on a rant, as you can tell, so I'll stop right there. But I'm appreciative of these kinds of perspectives, and I want more of them, especially on my channel, because it helps us who like to navel gaze. So,
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, that fullness of truth concept, I mean, I felt that in so many ways, that I was experiencing, that I was able to retain everything good and true and beautiful about the tradition that I grew up in. Not to mention everything good and true and beautiful that I had discovered along the way outside of religious, knowledge and those types of things, right? I just mean, like, the point of the fullness of truth, and the beautiful thing about Catholicism is the all encompassing nature of it, and the way that oftentimes God will work through really obscure, non-normative means to help people discover the fullness of truth. Like, and there's so many different pathways
yeah,
to the Catholic Church, and yet there's also a singularity. There's sort of a monolithic nature of it at the
yeah,
same time. There's a oneness, and it's just a wonderful. I don't know. I think it's something that Matt Fradd actually has said before, and I'm gonna butcher whatever he says, but it's he sort of encourages people, um not to require uniformity. Like, because it was something quote he talks about, like, the beautiful thing about Catholicism is kind of its universal nature, but we shouldn't require uniformity where the church doesn't require it. He kind of makes this really beautiful emphasis, and of course he's probably coming from an Eastern Catholic perspective and kind of trying to, I think,
yeah,
emphasize that there are equally valuable articulations of the same truth. And that's not some modernist mumbo jumbo. Like, that's just legitimate. There are multiple ways of understanding the same truth. There are ways to articulate it and express it differently. And I think we see that in kind of the Eastern and the Western expressions. But kind of
no, I
back
love it.
to
Yeah,
what compelled me. I mean, I think that was a big draw because, right, because motivation wise, unity, the search for unity was incredibly front and center for me in this search for what is Christian truth. I felt that Christianity at that point was the surest bet. So I wasn't kind of doubting, kind of like looking outside of it at that point. I think I did a little bit way back in the story, but at that point I was convinced that it was some version of Christian truth in the sort of philosophical sense.
hmm,
But discerning it, I guess what is it? I'm trying to pinpoint exactly. I've never actually identified this particular point, I don't think, in an interview. So I'm happy that you brought this out somehow.
yeah,
Because if the Catholic Church, if she is what she claims to be, right? If she is indeed the church, that the one true church that Christ founded, uh, you know, then wouldn't that be exactly what you would expect? A church that continues to try to reach the lost, a church that continues to express and articulate um, moral teaching that's relevant to cultures. That was another thing, man. That was another thing that had a profound impact for me, right? Addressing some of these really complicated moral situations in our world. And we can talk about both we don't have to get into the particulars, but
Mhm.
both the hot topic issues that we're seeing now and just more broadly speaking, I think over the past couple decades, seeing what the magisterium has put out in terms of their guidance for Christians trying to navigate these situations. I think back to like Pope Leo the 13th and his distinguishing and delineating between the proper use and the abuse of capitalistic tendencies as well as socialism, and kind of how he threads the needle and kind of beautifully articulates the Christian via Medea. Then you have kind of jumping forward to, I mean, goodness gracious, the Catholic Church put out this beautiful document about the use of technology and
Yeah.
all the dangers of it. And yet, in the fact, despite all those dangers, we are also compelled to use all the tools at our disposal as Christians. And it's this,
Mhm.
again, beautiful articulation of that tightrope that we have to walk as Catholics. And I started
Mhm.
to just take real notice and real interest in this because I saw a church that was at once timeless in a sense, right? You know, had the historical claim all the way back to the beginning, and was at the same time active and seeking this unity and this, I don't know, it was a profound impact to me though. It almost like the credibility that
Yeah.
that it established in my mind was profound. And I don't even know if I can fully pinpoint why. Maybe I did enough, but it
No,
was
that
really
makes sense.
impactful on me. Yeah.
Yeah, the church's witness is so important, and if it loses its sense of mission, it loses its purpose. And there's times I think when that does kind of, we have ebbs and what's the expression? Ebbs and flows. Uh,
Yes. I'm
yeah,
terrible at idioms. I butcher them all the time. So
I
I'm not the
know.
first person to help you with that.
No, but no, I mean, at one point, just a bit earlier, you mentioned that there's different paths to the church. It's funny because I think it's a very good way to express it, because you have these extremes where some people say that there's this kind of exclusivistic sense in which God's grace does not work outside of the visible bounds
Mm,
of the Catholic Church, and that somehow God is bound by the sacraments, which has never been the belief of the
right,
tradition.
right,
But then you
exactly.
also have this kind of relativism where every religion is a path to God. But I think the best way to put it is there's different paths to the church, and the church is really the way of salvation to God. And that's really that kind of reinforces this idea that the church isn't a denomination or a society within the world, which itself is fundamentally secular. No,
Mhm,
the church is cosmic, and really the kind of the beauty of its cosmic dimension, is I think what you kind of perceived. And so
mm.
I really, I think a sense of breadth is something that we've kind of lost because of the media as well. It's kind of created these echo chambers in which we live. Um,
And I
but it's
love the
funny.
breadth of Catholicism. I mean, the breadth of it is just it was just so beautiful to me. Like it's awesome.
Absolutely.
Sorry to cut you off.
No, 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 and I mean, that's exactly what I perceived in what you were saying. And what came to mind is the First Timothy 3:15, right? So they say the pillar and bulwark of the truth is the church. But
Mm,
I think people forget, what is church? What does that mean, right? Ecclesia. Another
called
word
out of,
that's
right?
used. The what? The gathering, yeah.
It's called, but yeah, that which is called out, being kind of, it evokes this kind of the calling out, the assembly, right? Back in the Old Testament. And
Yeah, the
yeah.
bringing together of many, right? But into what? Into one, right? And that's
Mhm,
where the other Greek word koinonia, right? So ecclesia and koinonia are kind of interchangeable. And the reason why that's cool is because koinonia means communion. And so really First Timothy 3:15 to me is basically saying the bulwark and foundation of the truth is the fullness of communion. Where there is that communion in its fullness, there is the truth. That's the Catholic claim. So the answer to everything you've been saying and looking for, and that the journey of yours is, with this intention of communion,
mhm,
is where is that communion that Jesus desired? Because surely there is the truth. And that's
mhm.
First Timothy 3:15. And
I
I
love
don't know. To me, that's not just you, but like I'm talking to all these Protestants, man, and they're saying the same thing. Unity is like this, it's
Yeah, I
on
know.
their radar. It's on their radar. And some of them are not even converted yet. They're telling me, like, yeah, this unity question is a big deal. I'm like, yeah, it is. Keep looking.
No, I'm starting to now hear little like things like that where I'll be like, oh man, like I know where you are in that journey. I mean, I don't want to be like arrogant and kind of assume that that's what they're gonna do, but like
Yeah.
I, in a kind of appreciative sense, I'm like, oh yeah, I was there. I remember that stepping stone on the way. No, and I'm
No, that's
glad that you
great.
noticed my emphasis, because I did choose my words carefully with the the multiple paths to the church, because I know that is controversial. And it's
Mhm.
interesting though, because as is often the case, right, with the Catholic claim, it threads the needle between two things that are partially true but wrong, and it
Yeah.
often kind of upsets both sides in the result. I mentioned earlier Pope Leo the 13th kind of both the greed associated with certain extreme versions of capitalism is condemned, as well as the extremes of socialism, and it's very like this kind of upsetting to a lot of people with their strongly held political views, but it's very much
Mhm.
threading the needle, kind of walking the path. And I think
Yeah.
that that's often the case. And I think even with this kind of thing, right, because the Catholic Church claims to contain the fullness of truth. It doesn't claim to contain exclusive access to the truth. I think that's an important distinction, right? And even
I
Scripture
love
tells
that.
us
Yeah.
that from the beginning of time, the creation. Oh man, I'm gonna butcher. I can't remember the verse. I'm terrible at quoting the verse. But the Scripture basically talking about like how general revelation proclaims God, so that no one was without excuse. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
passage.
Romans 1, I think it is. Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm so bad at
Yeah.
like
No,
citing
you're
things.
good.
I'll just remember them and I'll like mash together verses and like mix them together. I'm like, I think this is orthodox. No,
No,
I
you're
don't. I
good.
don't think. I promise I'll say no. No. Well, no formal heresies will be uttered on your show.
Only material ones.
Exactly. I can't promise all of that,
No,
but
well,
it was just
this is
something.
great. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Noah.
No, no, please, yeah, get us back. I got sidetracked in my own.
No, you're fine. I mean, I'm trying to find a way to wrap up. So maybe to kind of land the plane here.
Yeah.
You had that Presbyterian upbringing with good, solid role models, but tragedy in your life kind of made you think, experience in a deeper way. Questions that you had to think through,
Mm,
and then beauty really overwhelms you, and then the goodness of the lives of the saints, the moral compass, led you to think of Christianity in terms of unity, which brought you to the door of the sacramental nature and the cosmic
mhm,
nature of the church as a communion of believers. And especially the prospect of raising children made you basically kind of put your trust in what reason was leading you up to, and so
mm.
therefore you became Catholic. And by the way, I want to plug, now you work at Cross the Tiber, where you help Protestants who are curious about the Catholic Church. So maybe talk to us a little bit about Cross the Tiber if you want to go ahead and do that at this juncture.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Thank you. Yeah, so I was really fortunate that shortly after my conversion, which is coming up on 3 years ago on the feast day of Saint Nicholas, so
Nice.
very very much like in a couple of weeks we'll be at 3 years exactly.
Yeah.
Um, very quickly after that, I ended up moving up to where we now live, just north of the Atlanta area, and I got connected with Matt Fradd very early on because he happened to be living very close to me. So we met up at a local parish, a parish I now attend actually,
Yeah.
and he because I was so I'm trying to think how to tie this all together. So Matt Fradd and Ben Handelman were engaged in active discussions with various people who were asking them questions, right? But Matt was always a Catholic, like didn't kind of have the same background, and
Mhm.
started getting all these questions. And then Ben Handelman approached me because he knew of my particular background and my familiarity with Calvinism, because he had some people asking questions with
Mm.
respect to Calvinism. So he's like, "Hey, this would be great. Let me bring Noah on." And we had been connected through Matt Fradd's Marco Polo group of supporters at the time.
Mm.
So as a result of my conversion, right, we had these various donations that we were switching away from Protestant organizations, and we were like switching them over. And Pint to the
Yeah.
Quine was one of the sources that I was kind of consuming along the way during our conversion. We got a lot of value out of it. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll support that. So I got plugged into this Marco Polo group, and that's where I met
Yeah.
Ben, who brought me into these conversations on Marco Polo at the time. And I came from a startup background, so kind of by nature, I wanted to turn it into something bigger and more organized, and kind of, kind of help grow it. And yeah, but Ben kind of grew this idea. Matt helped promote it, and then I helped kind of formalize it and kind of helped us build an organization around it. So now Ben, myself, you, Kyle, a bunch of other people all volunteer our time, and effectively, we're trying to recreate the relational apologetics approach that I received as a result of this friendship that I mentioned, and this priest who was willing to take the time to walk alongside, hear my actual misconceptions, like hear me out, like hear my concerns, and then explain what the actual proper teaching was, and then hear questions that I might have or lingering concerns after I had that misconception cleared up. And I think that process took many different stages in my own conversion, with those two people in particular, but also more broadly speaking, that series of clear up a misconception, learn what the actual Catholic teaching is, then address real concerns with the actual teaching, right? Because you first have to clear up that misconception. So what we do across the Tiber is we try to provide that virtually for people who might not have someone in their life who can take the time, or who is well catechized as a Catholic and who can actually give them that information. So I know I just said a lot, but we try to be the relational bridge, connecting people to information about Catholicism. So it's all free
No,
and it's all
that
virtual. So
yeah, no, it's great because, and I've kind of joined the team with you guys, and honestly, I've been nothing but impressed. The way you guys handle things, I mean, it's very, charitable, concerned. You know where people are at, and you walk with them where they're at. There's no patronizing, and I've been nothing but impressed. So I think this is gonna do a lot of good, and it's gonna continue growing. And so, if you're a Protestant right now and you're listening to this video, I strongly encourage you to go check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes. Cross the Tiber. They have a website. We have a Discord. All kinds of people from all kinds of walks of life. I think it's a great ministry, and I think it's gonna grow. So strongly recommend. And thanks, Noah and Ben, and all the people who work at Cross the Tiber. I think we got a lot of stuff looking forward. So
yeah. No, I was humbled to
yeah.
be brought on and have the opportunity to give back so quickly. Like it was just like the perfect opportunity for me, and I was eager, right? I was excited and on fire and wanting to give back and have these conversations. So I'm grateful that Ben reached out to me that day. I feel like it was like such a fortunate thing. So, but yeah,
That's
no, thank you
wonderful.
for your help, and thank you for plugging it. Crossthetiber.org, .com also goes to the same place. But yeah, we'd love to have you.
Okay.
Anyone who's not a Catholic but interested in learning about Catholicism is welcome.
Excellent. Well, Noah, maybe this is a good place to end. Maybe I'll give you a last word, how to wrap up kind of our conversation, a kind of parting word for our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would just end with, what ultimately was the selling point for me, which was the authority claims of the Catholic Church, right? We've talked about all the things that attracted me, all the foundation laying and all of that, all the misconceptions that had to be overturned. And certainly I had many of those with respect to Mary and other things. I had all the classic misconceptions, right? We don't have to go into them, but I had all of those.
Hmm.
But like I said, in that step process, right, the misconceptions, then the proper teaching being articulated properly, that was such a crucial aspect. And reading the catechism for myself was perhaps one of the final kind of sealing the deal
Yeah.
points. But
Yeah.
I ultimately became convinced of the authority claims. I became convinced that Christ indeed founded a church, a visible church, which he gave authority to. And I believe that I was then convinced that authority was indeed passed down through apostolic succession, as understood by Catholics as well as Orthodox, as well as Coptic Christians. And certainly the fact that Orthodox and Coptics have maintained their belief in apostolic authority and succession was incredibly compelling to me. I will say, like, the probabilistic strength that adds to the claims of apostolic authority, more broadly speaking, is not inconsiderable. If you think about
Yeah.
historic separations, and they have no allegiance to the Pope, so they have no reason not to have changed something if it were not indeed. I don't know. It's just something. It's something to look into if you're a Protestant, looking into the shared claims among Catholic and Orthodox and Coptics, and comparing
Hmm.
that to the different understanding of Protestants, and just kind of parsing that out. So, but yeah, ultimately became for the authority claims. And to be quite honest with you, once I was convinced of that, and in particular of the essential role of the papacy with respect to unity. because we talked about
Yes.
unity, right? So then we talked about authority, but it was all came together and all came to head with this singular vicar of Christ being that visible representation of unity and the way that actual mechanism for the preservation of unity. That's kind
Yeah.
of where it all fell into place. And to be quite honest with you, the rest of the dominoes fell over pretty easily once I was convinced of the authority, because at that point it was like, I believe that this is true. I just need to figure out why it's true in some
Yeah.
sense, on those lesser issues.
Makes perfect
Hopefully,
sense.
didn't do it a disservice summing it up too quickly, but that
No, that's
really
great.
was the thrust of it, though. Yeah,
That's great. Yeah, and we could talk more about this too. We'll make more videos.
there's always more to
So,
talk about this. Yeah, this
yeah.
has been a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on.
Anytime, Noah. Thanks for coming on. Always a great time talking to you. Audience, thanks again for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. If you appreciate the work I do here at the Logos Project, you can support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. We also have some articles if you're interested at the Ecclesia blog. You can check that out. It'll be in the show notes. And so without further ado, Noah, thanks again. And we'll see everybody next time. Have a good one.
Thank you, Dom.